Today's episode is sponsored by P3R because they are gearing up for the marathon. The Dick's Sporting Goods Pittsburgh Marathon weekend of events all goes down May 2nd and 3rd. There's the big race and also a half you can run or walk it, the 5K, kids events, and more. So whether you're a first-timer hoping to push yourself to new limits or a grizzled ultra marathoner with tons of experience, there is space for yins. Use code CityCast15 to save 15% off any registration. That's thepittsburghmarathon.com. Use code CityCast15 for 15% off any event. This is CityCast Pittsburgh. I'm Megan Harris, and here's what Pittsburgh's talking about.
Executive producer Mallory Falk here. Earlier this month, a federal judge issued this pretty scathing ruling saying the Department of Justice cannot force a children's hospital here, UPMC Children's, to hand over medical records from young patients. I'm talking about this ruling and this case with Mimi McKenzie. She is legal director at the Public Interest Law Center, and she helped bring the legal case against the federal government. Mimi, to kick us off, what was your favorite line from the opinion? Because it was pretty spicy.
If it's okay with you, I'm going to pick two lines.
Please do.
And I'm quoting, "Its rhetoric regarding gender-affirming care reflects callous indifference, if not abject cruelty. There's more than a whiff of ill intent. Arguably, it's closer to a stench." That's highly unusual language coming from a federal district court.
That's not the type of thing you typically see when you're reading through a legal opinion?
No.
Well, let's get into the actual case here and what led to such an atypical opinion. So last summer, the DOJ sent this letter to UPMC Children's Hospital and a bunch of other providers across the country demanding information about minors who were receiving gender-affirming care. What information exactly did the DOJ want from these doctors and hospitals?
So the Department of Justice issued 20 subpoenas across the country. And the subpoenas, at least all of the ones that we have seen, are all the exact same. And what was most concerning were three requests in particular where they essentially sought all the medical records of minors who received gender-affirming care. So there were other parts of the request where they sought billing records from hospitals and things like that. But it was the request that sought not just the personally identifying information like names, social security numbers, addresses, but every single record. And if you know anything about gender-affirming care, there's a lot that goes into healthcare providers' decisions to provide that care for patients to receive it. So it's all the records of physical examinations, but also all the mental health records, sessions with therapists. Mm-hmm. In a nutshell, the most intimate details of a young person's life.
And just give us a little context here, like what kind of care were patients receiving that the government wanted to get information about?
There certainly is a range when it comes to gender-affirming care. At the, for lack of a better word, what I'll call the lowest level, it would be therapy, that type of thing. The vast majority of minors who are receiving gender-affirming care and that the government is seeking records on has to do with puberty blockers and hormone therapy. Despite the rumors to the contrary, surgery for minors seeking gender-affirming care is extremely rare, almost non-existent. So the care that the DOJ was seeking was very specifically asking for any minor who received hormone therapy or puberty blockers or surgery. So if a child was only receiving psychiatric support or psychological support, they were not going after just those records.
The DOJ initially said this was about investigating healthcare fraud. Why exactly did the government say it wanted or needed these kind of records?
Yeah, so that's been evolving, to say the least, from the opening day of the Trump administration. They made no secret about the fact that they were targeting transgender individuals. And, there were a whole range of executive actions taken by the administration. Everything from declaring that there are only two genders to issues around passports and that passports had to match the sex that an individual was assigned at birth, and executive orders around transgender individuals serving in the military, and going after and ending gender affirming care, particularly for minors. They've made no secret about the fact that that's a huge part of their agenda. So you can draw a direct line, if you will, from all those kinds of actions, from the attorney general calling gender affirming care for minors, calling it child abuse, genital mutilation. You can draw a direct line from that to these subpoenas. So I think it is very fair to say that the purpose all along for issuing these subpoenas was to intimidate healthcare providers from offering the care and to scare patients and their parents from seeking the care.
So these subpoenas go out. Obviously, patients and their families are freaking out about this. Tell me how you got involved with the case and came to represent some of the families that were being affected by these subpoenas.
Sure. So we actually have two cases going on. So I know today we're focused on the case involving UPMC that's been filed in the Western District of Pennsylvania. At the same time, we also have a case here in Philadelphia in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania for patients and their families who were treated at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. Basically, families just started reaching out to us, both in Philadelphia and in Pittsburgh. And in Philadelphia, CHOP had already filed a motion to quash the subpoena, but we thought it was really important that patients and their parents' voices have a seat at the table, if so to speak, because it's their records, it's their privacy rights that are at stake. In Pittsburgh, we had a slightly different situation because UPMC, we came to learn, had not filed a motion to quash the subpoena. So essentially, the only thing standing between the Department of Justice and the patients and their privacy interests in their records was our filing a motion to quash that subpoena.
The responsibility kind of ended up falling on the shoulders of patients and their families to advocate for themselves.
Yes.
Do you have a sense of how unique that is? From what I've been able to tell, it seems like in most other cases, hospital systems themselves filed a legal challenge.
Yes, there are multiple cases across the country where the hospital system or the providers took up the cause and were standing up for their patients' rights. Our case in Pittsburgh was the first case to be filed on behalf of patients themselves seeking to quash the subpoena. Since then, a couple of other cases around the country have been filed on behalf of patients for similar reasons, because the hospital systems themselves or the providers aren't seeking to protect their patients' records.
What do you think it says when the hospital system itself is not the one kind of going to bat for patients' privacy?
I think it's hugely disappointing. We are more than happy to take up the cause, but there are a couple of legal issues that are raised that would not otherwise be raised if the hospitals themselves took up the fight.
What kind of issues specifically?
We think we have a strong case that patients have standing to quash a subpoena that deals with their medical records, but there's certainly some arguments on the other side. There's statutory arguments, because I think when these laws and regulations were passed, no one quite contemplated a situation where a hospital wouldn't seek to protect their patients' records. But it's a wrinkle that we've just had to deal with and an issue that we've had to brief that's not present if the hospital themselves takes up the case. So there's that issue. And then there's the issue of, for example, in Pittsburgh, we represent 4 families, but we are seeking very broad relief. We're seeking to quash the subpoena requests for all patients, not just the 4 people we represent. That is also something that the Department of Justice has pushed back on, that at most we can only quash the subpoena for these 4 families. Now, the court here in Pittsburgh has not bought that. They think that we have standing and that the subpoena is quashed as to all patients. But that's another just legal hurdle that we have to overcome, and we feel confident about that. But that wouldn't exist in a situation where the hospital itself had the courage to stand up for their patients.
Have you been in communication at all with UPMC throughout this process?
We've talked to their lawyers, yes.
Are you able to share anything that they've said about how they're viewing this or why they've decided not to bring their own challenge?
The one thing they have said in their court filings and that they've said to us is we want to follow the law. And I do believe that they want to follow the law. Reading between the lines, they want a court to tell them what the law is. And I guess the one good takeaway is they have not turned over any patient records through these many months. And they won't until a court now orders them to do that. So,
are you able to share anything about the families you've worked with and what kind of gave them the strength and the motivation to bring this challenge?
Well, one of the things that's been really important here is the whole point of the litigation is to protect the privacy interests of the patients and their families. As a result of that, we brought this case under pseudonym. We had to ask the court for permission to do that. And actually, DOJ did not fight us on that. And so it's a little bit delicate because this is a situation where not only would these patients rather not have the whole world know who they are and where they live and, details about their lives, they really don't want the government to have that information because this is the same government that calls their treatment child abuse and talks about criminalizing this. So I don't want to share too many details about their lives because that's sort of the whole point of this is they shouldn't be in this position. But I can say, they love their kids like any of us love our kids, and they just want what's best for them. And the idea that our government has targeted their children is just heartbreaking and scary and awful. And I'm really in awe of their courage to stand up because it's not without some risk that someday this could all come out. And so I think they deserve our empathy, our outrage, our support.
Yeah. The duality of in seeking to safeguard their own privacy, they could inadvertently draw more attention to themselves.
Exactly.
I imagine is something they've really had to grapple with.
Today's show is supported by the Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh. Think about the last time you walked into a library. Maybe you were picking up your next great read, bringing your child to story time, studying for a test, or just looking for a quiet place to focus. In Pittsburgh, a lot of great stories start at the library. At Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh, people of all ages come to read, learn, and discover something new. And April 1st is Library Giving Day, a nationwide day to support the libraries that help our communities grow. Your gift keeps books, programs, and essential library services free for everyone. From early literacy to tutoring, job resources, and engaging learning opportunities that spark curiosity. So mark your calendar for April 1st. Donate at carnegielibrary.org/give. That's carnegielibrary.org/give to support Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh on Library Giving Day. Today's show is supported by the Westmoreland Museum of American Art and their upcoming floral exhibit, Art in Bloom. The Westmoreland's been on my list for a while, and I think that this exhibition is going to be such a fun introduction to the space. I am so excited to see how the curatorial team's setting up Art in Bloom. There's going to be these elaborate creations from floral designers who are all taking inspiration from the art the Westmoreland has on display. And you can vote for your favorite floral design in the People's Choice Awards. Sign up for floral arrangement workshops and demos, or just lean into the spring theme and celebrate with a tea party at the museum. Art in Bloom is running for just 5 days, so don't miss your chance to bask in all the colors and all the pretty scents. Admission's $10 for non-members, March 25th through 28th, and totally free on the final day of the show, March 29th. Advanced registration for all days is recommended. To register or learn more, visit thewestmoreland.org.
Well, let's get into your actual legal argument. Like, on what grounds did you say that the government shouldn't be able to demand this data and that children should not have to turn it over?
Yeah, so there's essentially two grounds that we raised in seeking to quash the UPMC subpoena. First is that patients have a constitutional privacy interest in these records, and there'd have to be some really compelling reason to overcome their privacy rights. So that's essentially a constitutional argument. And then the second argument is that this subpoena issued by the Department of Justice was issued in bad faith. So it's both the privacy interests of the patients, but then also looking at the Department of Justice's conduct here, their extreme overreach.
How do you go about proving somebody's doing something in bad faith?
Well, it's not so hard here because the agenda was never hidden. You know, from the get-go, their real purpose was to end gender-affirming care. And that is care that is legal here in Pennsylvania. And I guess it's one thing for the government to have that as a policy objective. Like, we don't like this care and we want to discourage it. But they can't use their subpoena power for that purpose. Their subpoena power needs to be because they actually are investigating some type of healthcare fraud and they need these records to establish that. But that's not what this is. And it's all there in the Department of Justice's, memos and public statements. So it's not so hard to show in a case like this. And in fact, sadly, even though the care is legal here in Pennsylvania, it's working. UPMC has ended most of its gender-affirming care. It's no longer providing puberty blockers or hormone therapy or those types of what for some children can be life-saving care. And they're celebrating it, the administration. So the evidence is in plain view here.
Yeah, what does it say to you when a healthcare provider stops providing something they're legally allowed to be providing? They were threatened with having federal funding taken away, and obviously they were one of the providers targeted in the subpoena. But what does it say to you that they chose to stop doing something that is legal in our state?
Yeah, it's deeply disappointing. I'm not involved in some of the other litigation. It might actually be illegal. There's some litigation going on alleging that by stopping the care, it's a form of discrimination. But it is, I think, deeply, deeply concerning that the federal government is going to these extreme lengths to try and regulate or control the practice of medicine when that is actually left to the states to regulate and control. I guess in some ways, too, it makes, I think, all of us who are working in this space more appreciative than ever that there are still courageous healthcare providers out there, like Children's Hospital of Philadelphia.
Yeah, right. On the eastern side of the state, we have an example of a hospital that's still providing the care they're legally entitled to provide.
Yes, yes.
So a loss that young patients can no longer get this care at UPMC Children's Hospital here in Pittsburgh. But there has been this win that the federal judge agreed with your arguments and said the DOJ can't force children's to hand over this information. Walk me through her rulings, because she agreed with you not once, but twice. There was an opinion in December and then another one earlier this month.
In December 24th, late in the day, the court issued a ruling that they were quashing the subpoena. And in particular, not the entire subpoena, but the requests that we were concerned about, which were the requests that went directly to patients' medical records. But kind of late in the game, there was a curveball, if you will, thrown by the Department of Justice, where they had offered to accept anonymized patient records, that they would accept that in lieu of the entire records. But the court didn't deal with all of that at once. They said, well, we're quashing these, but we hear that you're willing to accept anonymized records, so let us know if that changes anything. And so issued further briefing on that. So both sides, the patients and DOJ, we filed simultaneous briefs. DOJ arguing, oh, okay, well, now that we're willing to accept anonymized records, that moots all your claims, because there won't be any personally identifying information. And our response to that was that no, that doesn't change anything, for two reasons. First of all, your subpoena was still issued in bad faith. So anonymizing the records doesn't address the fact that you're not entitled to this in the first place. And second, these records are so rich with the details of kids' lives. You know, it's not just their names. It's not like an X-ray of a tibia. You know, it's everything from where they go to school and their friends and what sports they play. And so you can't anonymize them. Like, you just can't. And because in order to provide the care, there's so much that goes into that about a child's life. So in the second opinion then that was just recently issued, the court was very clear that, one, we're not buying DOJ's argument that this subpoena was issued for some kind of proper purpose. It wasn't. And two, there's no evidence to the contrary that you could somehow anonymize these records. And one way or another, every single court to be ruling on one of these subpoenas thus far has found that the Department of Justice is not entitled to these records. So I think it's fair to say that the federal district courts are upholding the rule of law, and that's wonderful.
Do you know how many cases have been ruled on at this point?
Oh, I don't know the number off the top of my head, but I know, for example, in Massachusetts, 2 in Seattle, there's 1 in Maryland, there's 1 in Colorado, Los Angeles. I mean, that's the other thing that's kind of interesting is there's definitely some inconsistency in the Department of Justice's approach to these cases. So in both the case that we're handling in Philadelphia and the case in Pittsburgh, the courts in both those cases have quashed the subpoenas to the extent they seek patient records. DOJ is appealing them. But in Los Angeles, they settled with Los Angeles, but it was a win for the patients in Los Angeles, and they're not turning over the records. And then in Pittsburgh, you know, they offered to accept anonymized records, but they haven't made that offer in other places. So it's inconsistent.
So they are appealing here with the Pittsburgh case. Like, what's next? Is this isn't necessarily done? It's going to keep going through the court?
Sure. So they've appealed the court's decision here in the Western District. They've also appealed the court's decision in the Eastern District. So both of those cases are now ultimately going to be before the Third Circuit and are marked as related cases. So the Third Circuit will ultimately decide both of these matters. And in the meantime, though, no patient records are being turned over. So that's good. And they won't be turned over unless the Third Circuit reverses the trial courts.
Do you have any sense of the odds of whether or not that would happen?
Oh, I don't know. Have you ever interviewed lawyers before? They never like to.
Gotta at least ask the question, even if I know I get the lawyerly response.
I'm gonna fall in that category. I mean, we're confident in our legal arguments. So I guess I would say I'm confident that the Third Circuit will rule in favor of the rights of children in their medical records. And I'm confident if they need to and want to reach the issue of bad faith, they will find that the subpoena was issued in bad faith.
Have you been in touch with the families since this ruling, and what have you heard from them?
Obviously, they were really pleased that the court is protecting their children's rights. I think they were pleased to see that the court was calling out DOJ's conduct for what it really is, but they can't help but worry that it's going up on appeal. So the fight isn't over. And even if they win at the Third Circuit, they could seek for the U.S. Supreme Court to take up the case. And but they're resilient and in it for the long run. And at the same time, though, this is only one battlefront in the administration's attack on their kids. I'm sure you're familiar with the Medicaid rules that the administration is promulgating, where they're seeking to put in place a rule that any hospital that provides gender-affirming care won't be able to receive any Medicaid reimbursements whatsoever for any other procedures. So, essentially this horrible choice between, do you want to provide gender-affirming care or do you want to be able to be reimbursed for treating all these other healthcare issues that children experience? Now, obviously, that will be litigated to the hilt before it becomes the law, but it's just never ending. So that's really, really hard. A lot of us who have kids can only imagine what it would feel like if the federal government were going after your child. It's I think to come full circle, it's just cruel. It's cruel.
I mean, bringing it full circle, you started by saying the language in the judge's opinion was highly unusual. You've worked on a lot of cases. How did this compare to other things you've read, and what do you think that tells us?
It's really unusual to see a court opinion have this type of language going after DOJ. But I think we're in just these really unusual times, and you see the headlines from other cases, not related to gender affirming care, but from the immigration space and other issues. And, I think a lot of the federal courts are really holding the line on the rule of law. And we're seeing conduct from our government that we've never seen before. And so it warrants this type of stinging rebuke. It does. So, I mean, that's sort of how we are certainly in unusual times. And that's why I think you're seeing some of this really forceful, strong language coming from the courts.
Mimi McKenzie, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And if this conversation has you wondering what young people are doing now that UPMC doesn't offer this type of care, stay tuned to the podcast because we are getting into that on an upcoming show. That's all for today here on CityCast Pittsburgh. If you learned something new from today's show, consider telling a friend about us or becoming a CityCast Pittsburgh neighbor at membership.citycast.fm. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more from around the city. Talk to you then.
I mean, I have Do Not Disturb on. I have my career as a podcast guest is crashing.